Hello, this is Pastor Rick, and I want to welcome you to the Sunday Forum for this Sunday, May the 12th. Our topic is a controversial one. Protests and violence on our college campuses here in the U.S., a Christian response. As you know, we have the Israeli-Hamas war, and that has serviced a whole beehive of moral issues all across the world and, of course, here at home, and that's particularly flared up on our college campuses. As you know, recently, in the last few days, Israel has warned the Palestinians to get out of Rafah because they're going to attack, but we know if they do attack, thousands more, especially women and children, will die, and they're doing this in defiance of international pressure. On the other hand, we have Columbia University here in New York, which has canceled its big graduation ceremonies, because they are worried about violence and that their Jewish students no longer feel safe on campus. And so these issues are weighing in on us. It's not just in the Middle East, it's here at home. The difficulty is real, and it's real for all of us, but I noticed it in a recent article about Jerry Seinfeld, of course, the famous comedian. He's known for his comedy about nothing. And yet, even though he became famous because he talked about nothing and made it funny, recently he's really found a political voice. And after October the 7th and the violence and the brutality of Hamas against Israel, he went to the Middle East, he went to Israel to visit families, Jewish families, those especially who had hostages taken at that time. And he tried and was successful at providing comfort and support, which you'd think would be a good thing. And he went with his wife, Jessica, who's known for her cookbooks and her philanthropy concerning food. And yet when they come back to the United States, he's attacked for taking a narrow, supportive approach to Israel, and by default, Netanyahu. And what were his opinions about the brutality of Israel against the Palestinians? And it just shows no matter what you do, no matter how righteous or no matter what your intentions are, you will get attacked when you take a position on these moral issues, on the war between Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians. So here we face this dilemma as well. When we speak out, and maybe when you speak out at the club or at home, you might get attacked by your family members or even by your closest friends. And so what are we to do with this one situation which is so fraught, which is, we're knee-deep in moral complexity? I mean, after all, it's not just what's happening over there. The U.S. supports Israel with weapons. And at the same time, we're supporting the Palestinians with food and medical support. Both sides of the war. That's complex. Now, all this is taking place on college campuses, which is typical. We remember this, those of us who went to college in the 60s and the 70s, with the anti-Vietnam protests as well. We understand what can happen on college campuses and the role that protests can play. But here you've got students who have ideas about the war and about how the war is unjust, but you also have faculty who I'm sure are divided, some supporting more the Palestinian position, others supporting the Israeli position. You have administrators who are trying to keep the whole institution together. You've got the board who has fiduciary and governance responsibilities. You have the donors who are often paying for the life of the university, and they also have opinions on the war, on which side they prefer or which side they take. You've got alumni who write letters, and they love their institution as well as the community at large, which embraces the college. And there, the president of the college has to stand amidst all those constituencies, and how do you lead responsibly when everybody involved with the college is playing from a different sheet of music. And so we're going to invite Mark Heclker, a member here of Emmanuel, a former president of Valparaiso University, and now a consultant to many of these presidents on this issue of free speech versus security on college campuses. This is what he's doing. He's consulting with these presidents to prepare them for these issues. And here he is, a member of Emmanuel on our church council, and participates and helps lead our Park Church worship. He's going to come in and speak to these issues. But to set up his conversation, let's talk a little about the moral ambiguity. It's not black and white. It's not simple, no matter what you hear on cable TV. Israel was given Palestinian lands in 1947, and the Palestinians protested that. But then after a few wars there in Israel, Israel occupied some more land, and the Palestinians protested this, sometimes peacefully, and sometimes they crossed the line, and the protests were violent. And that's what we saw with Hamas on October the 7th, where they violently attacked innocent Israeli citizens, and over 1,300 people were killed, 230 were taken hostage in this brutal act, obviously crossing a moral line. Well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Everyone seems to support that position, and yet in the war now, over 33,000 people have been killed, a shocking number, 2/3 of which are innocent women and children. Obviously, a line has been crossed here. And the Biden administration, on the one hand, supports Israel and provides weapons to Israel. That, would we say, is a good position, one that's traditional in the United States, but they've done it without any constraints, which is against American law. That's obviously crossed a line. And on the other side, we have protest students for the war, against the war. Some of them have been peaceful. Now they've become violent on our college campuses, so much so that, well, some universities can't even hold safely their graduation ceremonies. And many Jewish students, they don't feel safe because protests are often mixed with anti-Semitism here in the United States. But now even some of the counter-protests against the pro-Palestinian protesters have grown violent themselves. All sorts of lines are being crossed all the time. As we say in the church, you're both a sinner and a saint. That's the complexity of the situation. So now we want to hear from Mark Heclker as he describes how he views the situation and what a Christian response might look like. Mark, welcome to the Sunday Forum. Mark, it's great that you can join us here on the Sunday Forum, especially to share with us some of your expertise, both as a college university president, but also now as one who is consulting other presidents on how to deal with, how to address these protests on our U.S. campuses. So again, welcome to the Sunday Forum, Mark.
Well, thanks, Pastor Rick. It's good to be here. And yes, there are lots of conversations going on.
So let's get into it. We're all reading the news, as are you, but you're also kind of in the midst talking with these presidents on campuses. As we first of all address this topic, share with us how you understand the situation, both on our college campuses, but also what they're often addressing, which is the Israel-Hamas war.
Certainly. Well, let me just start, before we start talking about what's playing out on our campuses, just some context, right? All the context is so important as we're looking at all of the dimensions of this particular situation. And just as a reminder that Christians are considered a minority in Israel and within the Palestinian territories. About 1.9% of the entire Israeli-Palestinian population is a practicing or a cultural Christian. And then on the West Bank, that's Bethlehem, and in that area adjacent to Jerusalem, the Christians represent about 2.5% of the population. Down in Gaza, less than 1%. So overall, about 185,000 Christians that are living and working in Israel and Palestine. And 80% of those Christians identify as Arab and Palestinian. So most of the Christians that are in Israel are Arab Palestinians, whether they be out in actually the country of Israel or segregated and operating within one of the two Palestinian governed areas within Israel. So,
I think we could say that those are Lutherans too.
They are.
I would say, punch above their weight as far as influence in that part of the world.
They sure do. The Christmas church in Bethlehem is led by a Palestinian Christian, Mitri Rahab, who's also president of the Lutheran University that is in Bethlehem, Dar al-Kalama. And then the Palestinian hospital that serves really most Palestinians, not Gaza, because Gaza is not permitted to send patients to the hospital, but it's right there on the top of the Mount of Olives, and that is also run by the Lutheran Church. So yes, Lutherans do punch above their weight.
I would say that most places in the world, the Roman Catholics have the best properties, but not in Jerusalem. We've got the top of the Mount of Olives, which is just a great place for ministry, but also just a great property.
So let's turn to what's happening on our college campuses to get a sense of it. These are not. They're tough to generalize. There are some common properties, but be aware that institutional context is really important in each one of these situations. Kind of the media, social media, try to lump all these things together. So there are many forms of what's happening out there. There are demonstrations and protests. We certainly hear a lot about encampments on college campuses. That is setting up tents in a quad of a campus, which is the cross section of all the people that are moving about the campus. And then there are occupations of buildings that are occurring. Nearly all, and I mean this, nearly all of these protests are peaceful and nonviolent. So that's something to remember. We certainly see on our televisions those very rare instances where the situation turns violent. And these protesters have demands. They always do. A number of them are asking for their university to divest their investments from any company that may be providing military support or armaments to Israel as part of their primary business, which then gets the Board of Trustees involved as to whether or not they can, one, identify those investments. The investment of endowment is very complicated, and whether or not they can segregate them out. They're also looking in some cases for scholarships to bring Palestinian students to study at their institutions, or perhaps to invite Palestinian faculty to come and be in residence at their universities so that they can contribute to the students' education in these cases. In most cases, the students are demonstrating support for the Palestinian people. And I understand in the introduction that Pastor Rick has kind of laid out the whole history there of the conflict and the Palestinian people. These student demonstrators view the Palestinians as oppressed people who have acted out violently after decades of repression, and because there seems to be no hope for a future solution. I don't think these students, by and large, are condoning the violence that occurred on October 7th in any way, but they do believe that the root causes for that outbreak are long and complicated, and that the Palestinians do need that support.
Mark, let me just ask you there, as you just explained this interest, this concern for the Palestinians and their suffering, often our people compare what's happening now, the protests on campuses, to what happened in Vietnam, because that was what many of our people experienced growing up. Do you see any similarities or differences? And I was picking up the differences in some of these comments you were just making, and advocating for another group who's suffering outside the U.S. But how would you see the similarities and the differences?
Yep, so that's the difference, right? We're advocating for a situation that is not occurring or does not affect most of these students directly. Some, yes, most definitely, but not the majority. In the 1960s, the protest against the Vietnam War affected students directly. That is, they could be called up by the draft and sent over to Vietnam, and their friends were dying, and so there was outrage that occurred. The other is that as the protests wore on, they became opportunities for organized violence. So you had Students for Democratic Society, the Black Panthers, a variety of other organizations that were operating under the surface that were inciting violence on their campuses, the burning of buildings. In fact, even Valparaiso was a stop for the SDS as they were going to Chicago for the Democratic National Convention, and they burned down the administration building on the campus
Wow, I didn't know that.
as part of the 60s. So Valpo was absolutely deeply involved in that. So I would say those are the biggest differences that would be my observation between
Let
the
me add
60s
one more question then, Mark, because I would think the students, from what I've read, feel, however, that they are somehow complicit in the violence and that it is our government delivering on weapons. It is the university endowments which are supporting certain investments. And also, I think on the other side, we're always complicit, it seems like, in anti-Semitism. There always is something about our society that often can give in to those impulses. How would you describe that? Is that accurate?
I think it's accurate. I'd add one other dimension to this. So, you have seen the anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion movement in and among Republican legislatures in the country, right, where these anti-DEI laws have been passed because there's purportedly indoctrination. And when you're on a college campus, it looks very different than what it is being represented by folks in politics and in media. On a college campus, you're trying to make sure that you have equitable student outcomes. Regardless of where you come from, you should have the same opportunity. And that the outcomes should be similar. That is, it shouldn't be that the white students get better jobs and higher salaries and more of them graduate and more of them are retained. And the students that come from a Hispanic background or a Black background have far lower outcomes. So you're trying to figure out how you can provide equitable student success in the institution, and these were the methods that colleges were using. And so as part of that, there was a very great concern that students be able to speak freely about their condition. Mm-hmm. And so, there was certainly encouragement among these marginalized communities to step up and be able to express themselves and their concerns in the public forum, and to have what we would say would be, equal and moderated dialogue. And the university's role was to just bring these disparate viewpoints together and let them be in dialogue with one another, and eventually, help students learn how to navigate that when they get out in society. Well, on our college campuses, the moment the pro-Palestinian folks started to raise their hand after the war, the administration clamped down. No, you can't say that. You can't do that. So some of what's going on is a response that, wait a minute, is free speech and the support of divergent points of view only apply to certain identities and not to others? So that's another thing that's happening on the surface on these campuses.
So as you move around the various colleges and universities, are there some college presidents who are in this really tough position to lead among all these constituents? Do you see some colleges that you think are doing it right, that you could lift up? And I'm not going to ask you to name the ones who are doing it wrong, but what do you see as good techniques for fostering positive dialogue in a safe environment versus some other actions that maybe have even made the situation worse?
So recognize that presidents in this situation, as kind of you set up, are in a no-win situation. There's nothing they can do that is going to appease these diametrically opposed constituencies, and there are many of them. So you have to try your best to do the right thing, and to do it and to ground it in the values you hold as an institution, and what it means to be a university, which is to not take sides and to help facilitate people talking to one another and helping them to make informed decisions as citizens. So the presidents that have done that work, that have been willing to sit down with the leaders of the protest, to listen to their concerns, to do so in a way that is thoughtful and respectful and honors their position, but at the same time is able to represent there are other positions and other ways of thinking about this. And my role as president is to try to find a place where we can live together even though our differences are irreconcilable. So how do we work toward that together, right? That's the beloved community, right? How do we work through all of that together? And out of that comes, in essence, an agreement to form task forces or committees to look at this issue of divestment, to bring the board in and have a conversation, to talk about what we might do to bring more informed people to our campus to talk through the issues. And it can emerge, as it did, I believe, at Northwestern, where they agreed to such a task force, and they agreed to provide scholarships for 5 Palestinian students and to bring 3 Palestinian scholars onto the campus. That's probably the best example. And there are many that you haven't read about because they don't hit the airwaves. But when you have counter protesters who are throwing those riot fences on the protesters and throwing rocks and bottles on the protesters, and the police on the campus stand by and watch it and let it go on for more than an hour, and then other police come in riot gear with billy clubs and start putting the wire ties on people and doing it so tight that their hands are purple, throwing them to the ground, all those sorts of things, all of which took place at UCLA, and some of which took place at Columbia. Then you have an escalation. The protest becomes bigger. Part of the reason this is a national phenomenon is because Columbia chose to do what it did right after that congressional hearing. That's why we're all, from my vantage point, of course, it's more complicated than that, but that contributed to the spread of these protests across our campuses.
And we mentioned in the introduction too, Mark, that Columbia, I think, has canceled its plenary graduation then.
They have.
Upcoming, and because they're just there's now a cycle of mistrust or maybe even violence and anti-Semitism, which they want to avoid. You know, as you discuss these measures and techniques with presidents, you've just mentioned, how does a university, how does an institution stick with its values? And I'm wondering, as a Christian, what do you bring as far as your own values, your own understanding, even the history of the church in these matters? And, you know, we've not always done this very well, obviously, especially as Lutherans. But what are some of the insights you think which you can share that are from your Christian background that you bring to such situations?
So I'll marry the two. So at Valparaiso, we would often cite Micah 6:8, right? And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. And we framed a lot of our thinking and action around our desire to do what the Lord requires us to do. And so if you take that lens, then a Christian response in this situation it is certainly to learn about, fully understand it, and do what we can to work for justice in the environment that's going on, to offer mercy to those who have wronged us or those who have wronged others, but to let mercy be part of this, grace be a part of this question and this conversation. And then, of course, with humility, there's Christian humility and there's intellectual humility, and I'll put the two together and say that it is always helpful to say to yourself, you know what, this position that I may be holding could be wrong. I could be wrong. And when you admit you could be wrong, you invite yourself into a conversation to understand more deeply about what's happening. I think we have to recognize that we are not the keepers of the truth. We don't have insight into the truth, only to the extent that God gives us that insight. And just remember, this is a journey with God, and God reveals the truth, and God reveals the truth over time. And the truth becomes clearer and clearer over time. And so remembering that, then I think we've got to ground ourselves in prayer, right? We've got to be praying for guidance so that we don't take this on ourselves, but we ask God to guide us. We ask God to give us direction. We ask God to give us wisdom and understanding. And that would be, at least from my vantage point, a Christian response. And we are human, and we are going to make mistakes, as Martin Luther made mistakes related to the Jews, as Lutherans as a church made mistakes related to the Nazis. And so we recognize we could be wrong, right? And always keep that in our forefront as we're thinking about these issues.
Mark, that's a wonderful way to, I think, end our interview with that encouragement, both of prayer and of humility. Because as you mentioned correctly, we have a track record as a church, and it's not always been good, even in the recent past. And so that humility should inform us as we pray, as we ask God for the truth on how to move forward. Mark, again, for your insight, even for the role that you're playing, I want to give you thanks and for joining us and sharing your wisdom here on the Sunday Forum.
Thank you. It's been a blessing to be with you today.
I want to thank Mark Heclker again for this wonderful interview. Much more could be said. We could talk with Mark for hours about his views, because it's good to hear from one who's actually involved with the presidents and helps them with their leadership in these morally difficult times. But here, I want to map out traditionally 5 approaches that Christians have taken to morally complex issues. But before we start, we have to say, are you praying? Because as Christians, when we don't pray, that's a sign that we don't have faith that God is in charge. And so an initial point is, Christians, we pray. And we inform ourselves so that our prayers aren't just floating in general, but we bring details and content to our prayers. So inform yourselves and pray. And then here are 5 responses. Christians have first always bandaged the wounds of those who've been hurt in any crisis. And we don't ask about moral culpitude here. If someone's in prison, we bandage their wounds. If someone is hurt and in the hospital, we bandage their wounds. Christians take care of those who are sick, who are ill, and who have been hurt, and we don't ask the moral question. Secondly, we bury the dead. Often when families have lost loved ones, when troops have been killed at war, even if it's the enemy, we bury the dead. And we do so in the name of Jesus. This is part of our ministry and talking about resurrection and hope in the face of disease and death. So we bandage the wounded, we bury the dead, and then the third is we act responsibly according to our calls in life and according to our vocations. Some of us have direct responsibility in this war, like President Biden, like those in Congress who voted for a package to support the war, both on the Israeli side with weapons and with the Palestinians with food and medical devices. But our job as citizens, we also have responsibility to engage our representatives. We acknowledge their callings, but our callings in a democracy are also important. We can write letters, we can advocate, we can call. There are things that we can do to get involved and take our responsibility seriously. The fourth, though, is resistance. And this we learned from Martin Luther King Jr., that this protest becomes resistance, but he emphasized it should be nonviolent. So his technique, whether approaching governments or business leaders or wherever it might be, was to practice nonviolent resistance. But the fifth we learned from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran theologian in Germany during World War II, and he spoke about putting a spoke in the wheel of government. He saw Hitler, he saw how violent Hitler was, and he compared Hitler to a madman driving a car, weaving all through town, just killing people. And he said it's not enough just to bandage the wounded or to bury the dead. There comes a point where one has to resist and protest by putting a spoke in the wheel. And we know that Bonhoeffer participated in the opposition to Hitler. Okay, those are the 5 Christian points I wanted to bring out today. Each of them needs discussion, and so I want to welcome you to this Sunday forum where we'll discuss those beginning at 10:15 on Sunday. Join us for the discussion. Bye-bye.